Hi guys, welcome back to the channel. My name's Jared and today I just wanted to talk about my Skyline now that I've pretty much hit the 200,000 kilometer mark. I know these are becoming quite popular now that the prices have come down. Silvias and older Skylines have gone up. So yeah, I guess we'll start back when I purchased the car. So I've owned the car for 4 years now and I bought it when it had 130,000 kilometers on it and I paid $8,000. It came with the NKRPF ones that are on it now, but the tires were right on the tread indicators. So pretty much when I bought the car, I had to do 4 new tires straight away on it. So when I first bought the car, I didn't really know what condition it was in, so I pretty much did a full service on it. So all the oils, transmission, diff, engine, done coolant, just checked the clutch and brake, master cylinders and the reservoirs on them. And it came with the front lower control arm bushes, the inner bush. They were broken, which apparently is a really common issue on these. The actual lower control arm, you could actually move it. The bush had like separated and the arm had gone to the back where it was mounted. The car was still driving, but because of that, you couldn't actually go to full lock. So I had to change that bush. GK Tech sells a spherical bush that you can install there. That's what I would recommend. And also when I first picked up the car, it had some noise coming from the back, which ended up being the rear wheel bearings. So I had to replace both rear wheel bearings pretty much as soon as I bought it. They were pretty bad. Apparently, again, relatively common issue on the cars. Haven't had to do the front, but yeah, I had to do both backs and they weren't particularly cheap. I think it was about $150 per side to do those. I did them myself as well, but I imagine if you had to pay someone, you're probably going to be looking at about $500 or more to get that done. Then when we got to 140,000 kilometers, that's when the electric windows started to become an issue, and the passenger one didn't want to go up. You had to keep flicking it and sort of give it a bit of help to go out. So at that point I just ordered some non-genuine electric window motors for both sides, and I think I paid about $200 for a set of them, and that resolved the issue. Also, while I was doing that, I decided to upgrade the radio in the car because at that point I was just using an FM transmitter. The original tape deck in the car had actually broken, so I couldn't use the tape to aux. I was just using the FM transmitter. If you are wanting to install a radio in these cars, you have to buy the fascia unit. It doesn't just have a standard doubled-in slot where you can just throw in a generic radio. You have to buy the fascia with the climate control buttons in it and install that. And these fascias are like $400 Australian, and then whatever radio you decide to go with. So I did that all at that point. Then when about 160,000 kilometer mark, the clutch on the aircon compressor actually fell off when I was driving. So it was a bit funny where I just keep putting the button on and off for about a month to get the aircon to work. I was assuming maybe the pressure in the system was getting low and the sensor was it was in and out of the pressure range. But then when I took it to get regassed, they saw that the clutch had actually fallen off. So I wasn't able to find a clutch for it, but I ended up just going to the wreckers and picking up another compressor and taking the clutch off that. It's pretty much just a 10mm bolt in the M6 10mm head bolt in the middle, and you just chuck it on with the shims, and I Loctite it in, and after that it worked. So I thought that was a bit strange. So somewhere on the side of the road, my clutch my aircon's still sitting there. Also at that point I needed to change the clutch. The clutch wasn't slipping, but it started to make a bit of a grinding noise, not just when you had your foot depressed like on the release bearing, but pretty much all the time, and more so when you first just start the car up. So I decided to go single mass at that point. Everyone online said there wasn't any issues, and yeah, after a week of driving I couldn't even tell the difference between the dual mass and single mass. But when I took that apart, the clutch pivot ball had actually snapped off. Even though the clutch was still working, that was snapped and I had to replace that. And at the same time I did the rear main seal, even though at 160,000 kilometers it still wasn't leaking. Then at 165,000 kilometer mark I had to do the headlight on the driver's side. It just broke and then I had to replace it. They aren't particularly cheap headlight. They're a HID globe, D2R if you're wondering. I ended up buying a generic one from Burson's and that was about $100. But some of the other replacements I've seen are about $200 a globe. So yeah, you might want to expect that to happen. I mean, on most cars they don't. I think that's pretty good kilometers for how long the globe actually lasted. The one on the passenger side I still haven't replaced, but the color of the two globes is slightly different. I guess the other thing to talk about with these headlights is they are plastic. So expect you're going to need to polish them up. I pretty much do it every 6 months at the moment. It's just getting worse and worse as the car gets older. I'm thinking about getting some new lights in the future. And at 175,000 kilometers, I had the engine light and slip light come up on the dash. Did a bit of research, got the code scanned, and it was for a camshaft position sensor. So at that point, I looked online. It's a very common issue for these cars. Actually, most people get it a bit earlier on. So I decided just to go replace both of them, and I bought some genuine ones, and they're about $180, $200 per sensor. So that was a relatively expensive fix. It's not too bad. You should be able to do the job yourself. And there is cheaper China ones you can go with, but I just wanted to put the proper one in there and have that peace of mind. Because when it did go, it was difficult to start and it was sort of dying out a bit here and there. Then I hit 180,000 kilometers and at that point I changed the belts on my car. So the accessory belt for the water pump and alternator and power steering, and then I also did the air conditioner belt at the same time. I also at that point did the spark plugs on the engine, and they were really quite bad when I took them out. I think they were still the original ones that hadn't been touched. So I put all new iridium spark plugs in. They were about $200 for a set of 6, so it's not cheap to replace them. I did notice on the passenger side, last cylinder, I'm not sure if it's number 6 or 5, but the oil there was a bit of oil in that spark plug when I took it out. And I know it's very common for the rocker cover gaskets to leak. Luckily mine's not leaking on the outside of the engine, but there was just a small amount of oil in the spark plug tube. But since I've changed to 1040, that oil in there has disappeared actually. At 180,000 kilometers, I also had the radiator break on me. So the upper coolant neck, it actually cracked there in the plastic and I lost all my coolant when I was driving. Luckily, the temperature started going up just as I arrived at work and I was able to change the radiator at work. So I just put in a OEM style replacement radiator. I didn't go with the alloy one. I wish I did, but I was in a rush at that point because I needed to drive the car and the radiator was broken. So I couldn't wait for eBay to send a radiator. So I just went to the local store, ordered it and had it the same day and put it in. Then at 186,000 kilometer mark, I had to change my battery, but that's entirely dependent on the battery in your car, how old it was. So the one in the car that I had was 7 years old, which is I think that's pretty good for a lead acid battery. And at that point, I got a code for oxygen sensors. So one of them upstream, so before the cat went out, and I just decided to replace both of them, which is not a particularly easy job. It's easier probably if you remove the cat and do it off the car. Doing it on the car is like almost impossible. And also removing the cat is not the easiest thing either. There is a very terrible bolt on the driver's side. You have to get through the engine bay from the top. So expect to probably spend at least half a day or so on that job if it's the first time those cats have ever come out. But if you've taken them out previously, then it should be a couple of hour job, not too bad. Note that with those oxygen sensors, you can still drive around with them in fault, but your fuel economy is not going to be the greatest. Then 190,000 kilometers, I changed the rear pads. When I got the car at 130,000 kilometers, they were quite low, and I got all the way to 190 pretty much before I replaced them. There was still some life left on them, but I was going for a roadworthy, and I just threw in some new Brembo pads. I have not yet replaced any of the discs on the car. The front has a bit of a lip on it, but it's not on the... I don't think it doesn't necessarily need replacing yet. I want to replace them in the future with some slotted ones, but at the moment they're still fine. That time when I was going for my roadworthy, I also had to replace the lower shock bushes on the front lower control arms, because the bush had actually sagged down. And I also, they didn't get me on during the inspection, but after I noticed the rear diff was sort of banging a bit when I was changing gears. So the rear diff bush ended up being like half torn, and it was actually front and back, it was moving like this when you change gears. So I ended up throwing in a polyurethane diff bush, and that helped heaps. I didn't realize how bad it actually was until I replaced that. There's quite a few on the market you can go with, and GK Techs sell a tool to extract that because it is quite difficult to pull that bush out of the subframe on the car. Also, at 190,000 kilometer mark when I was going for the roadworthy, I did the inner and outer tie rods. So they picked up that there was a bit of movement in the wheel. It wasn't horrendous, and I couldn't really notice it when I was driving, but yes, the inner tie rod actually had the movement, and I just decided to do the outers even though there was nothing wrong with them at that point. Also, the rubber boot on the lower front ball joint was torn on the driver's side, so I just bought a pair of them and got them replaced at the same point. They asked me to do the steering rack bush at that time. I did it and replaced it with some poly bushes, but when I removed them there was nothing wrong with them, and then like I said, the issue ended up being the inner tie rod, not the actual rack itself. Also, now I'm at 200,000 kilometer mark, I've started to notice the rear tail lights fading as well on the plastic, and also the rear seat, because the glass and the seat sits right underneath it. It gets a lot of direct sunlight during the day, so the leather on the top of the rear seat has shrunk and the stitching actually has split on it. So I would highly recommend getting your rear window tinted or putting like a blanket or cloth over that seat to prevent that from occurring. Also, my driver's seat on the electric functions, the tilt left and right, it only tilts towards center. You can't actually tilt it towards the door. So the rod on that is damaged. I also had a nut come loose on that seat. And also when I had it out, the bracket that holds the back portion of the seat to the bottom there was also a crack forming in that I had to weld up. In terms of the paintwork, the paint has actually stood up really well considering the age of the car and how long it's been outside for most of its life. I'm just starting to see some fade occur on the panel above the windows and also on the roof. But I put on a roof wrap about 30,000 kilometers ago, and that hopefully has prevented more of that fading on the roof from progressing. Also, not long after I got the car, the electric folding mirrors started to play up. So sometimes when I started the car, they just folded in, out, in, out, in, out a bunch of times. Then after the first year or so, they actually didn't fold in anymore. That was it. So now the electric function on the mirror doesn't work. You can still adjust them electronically, but the folding part, only the passenger mirror folds in now, the driver's side doesn't. Okay, in terms of future maintenance, I'm actually deciding I'm going to change the fuel pump. So I bought a replacement fuel pump to go in because I read online, people said about 200,000 kilometers the fuel pump decides to die. So I just thought, F it, I'm just going to replace it. I don't care, like it was only $130. So I'm going to chuck that in, which is pretty easy. Also, I've started to notice there is a slight sort of knock from the rear shocks on the car when you go over like a really big bump. For the most part, it still drives really well, but I can tell the springs on the suspension have definitely sagged over the life of the vehicle. And yeah, the shock is just starting to knock a bit in the back, so I'd like to put some coilovers in it in the future. Also, like I said, the discs are pretty much at that point where they need to be replaced as well, so I want to do slotted discs, front and rear. And the other thing is, with the wheel alignment, it's quite limited in the amount of adjustment you can get, so I want to chuck on some GK Tech adjustable arms on the front and the rear just to dial in that alignment better. Overall, I'm really happy with this car. It's been the most reliable car that I've owned. It's never actually broken down on me. We've had to stop on the side of the road. It's never not started. Yeah, all of these things I've just replaced as I was servicing the car and I just noticed. So nothing was really a surprise in that regards. I would recommend, if you're living in Australia, to go to 10W40 engine oil. It is going to help the seals on your car because it is a lot hotter here than other climates. It does say 1030 or 530 on the oil cap, but yeah, definitely go the 1040 if you can. It's going to help the seals on the engine last longer. Also, the car does not have one single leak anywhere. Not from the oil pan, not from any gaskets, not from the rear main, the diff, the transmission, the coolant, anywhere. It's been super good, like super clean, no issues. I know also that the ignition coils can be a problem on these cars as well. So far, no issues for me, but I'm sort of expecting soon that maybe I'll have to replace all the coils on the engine when I get one of those misfire codes. So 100%, I would recommend buying a Skyline or 350Z as a daily. I think it's a very reliable vehicle, and I can see now why a lot of people have gone to these for drifting. If you have any questions, you have any of your own stories from owning these cars, put them down in the comments below. If not, do me a favor, like, comment, subscribe, share the video, and I'll see you for the next one.